The evening sun burned low in the wide Arizona sky, turning the land gold and red. Dust rolled across the valley, whispering through dry grass and broken fences. Ethan Carter rode alone, his horse's slow steps echoing in the silence. He had been alone for years, ever since he returned from the war. People in town called him the quiet cowboy. He didn't speak much, didn't laugh much, and didn't drink with others. His small ranch sat far from the road, where only wind and silence were his company. That day, Ethan was checking the water troughs when he noticed something unusual. Down by the dry creek bed there was smoke, a small trail rising weakly. He thought maybe some ranch hands had camped nearby, but when he went closer he heard faint voices. They were soft and broken, more like cries than words. Ethan slid off his horse and followed the sound. As he reached a cluster of rocks, he saw something that made him stop cold. 3 young women sat on the ground tied to a broken wagon post. Their clothes were torn, their hands bound, their eyes hollow. They looked half-starved and terrified. A few feet away lay the remains of a campfire and wagon wheels. Whoever brought them there had left in a hurry. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. He knew from their dark hair, copper skin, and jewelry made of bone and beads that they were Apache. He also knew how much trouble this could bring him. White settlers and Apache tribes were still at odds, and anyone helping the other side could be called a traitor. But Ethan was not the kind of man to walk away. He stepped forward slowly so they wouldn't panic. "Easy," he said softly, raising his hands. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The women watched him with fear. The oldest looked ready to fight, though she could barely stand. Ethan took out his knife and cut the ropes. Their wrists were red and raw. He offered his canteen. The youngest drank greedily, then passed it to the others. As they drank, Ethan saw one of them, maybe in her early 20s, pull something from under her torn blanket. It was an apple, small, dusty, bruised. She broke it into 3 pieces with her weak hands. Each of the women took a piece, then she turned to Ethan and held out the last bit to him. He froze. They were starving, and yet she shared her food with a stranger. Ethan's throat tightened. He took the apple slowly and ate it without a word. It was dry and sour, but it felt like the sweetest thing he had tasted in years. He motioned for them to follow him. They didn't understand his words, but they trusted his eyes. One by one, they climbed onto his horse and he led them home on foot, guiding his horse through the dusty trail until the outline of his ranch appeared under the fading light. When they arrived, he gave them warm water to wash and clean clothes that once belonged to his late sister. He cooked beans, bread, and stew, though he wasn't much of a cook. The women ate slowly, whispering to one another. Their eyes softened with each bite. After dinner, they sat by the fire in the barn, too tired to speak. Ethan brought them blankets and an old oil lamp. The women smiled shyly, and the one who had given him the apple pointed to herself and said, "Lena." Ethan nodded. "Lena," he repeated, pointing to her. Then he pointed to the others. They spoke their names, soft and musical, though he could barely pronounce them. He smiled anyway, and for the first time in many years he felt a bit of warmth spread in his chest. Days passed and the ranch changed. The 3 women helped him mend fences, fetch water, and feed the animals. They worked hard, though they spoke little English. Ethan taught them small words like horse, water, food. They taught him Apache words in return, names of stars, winds, and rivers. At night, they sat near the fireplace. Ethan would play a slow tune on his old harmonica. The women listened quietly, eyes reflecting the firelight. Sometimes Lena hummed along. Her voice was soft and sad, like wind through pine trees. It made the loneliness in Ethan's heart fade a little more each night. One afternoon, after fixing the barn roof, Ethan decided to carve something from the wood scraps left behind. He took his knife and shaped 3 small apples from the pine pieces. The edges were rough, but he polished them smooth. When he gave one to each woman, they stared at him with tears in their eyes. They understood the meaning. The apple they had shared had saved their lives. Ethan smiled and said, "Safe." Lena touched her heart, then the apple, then pointed at him. He didn't need words to understand, but peace in that land never lasted long. A few days later, while he was checking the pasture at sunrise, Ethan noticed thin smoke rising from the far ridge again. This time it wasn't a campfire. It was a signal, an Apache smoke signal. His heart sank. He looked toward the barn where the women were feeding the horses. When he returned, he saw the fear in their eyes. Lena spoke quickly in her language, hands trembling. The youngest grabbed his arm, pointing toward the hills. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he understood the fear. That night he kept his rifle loaded by the door, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. The desert was too quiet. Even the coyotes had stopped howling. The women couldn't sleep, and neither could he. By morning, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. Dust clouds moved toward him, many riders. The three women ran to the window and froze. It was an Apache war party. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew they might think he had captured the women. He knew what would happen to any white man found with Apache prisoners. But he also knew he couldn't run. He walked to the barn and took one of the wooden apples he had carved. He stood outside in plain sight, holding it high in his hand. The riders stopped a few yards away, surrounding the ranch. Their faces were painted with symbols of war. Spears and rifles glinted in the sun. The leader, a tall man with feathers braided into his dark hair, rode forward. He said something in Apache. The women rushed out from the barn and cried out in their language. Ethan stood still, his heart racing but his eyes steady. Lena pointed at him, her voice shaking but firm. She showed her scarred wrists, then touched her chest, then pointed to the apple he held. The warriors murmured among themselves, their eyes shifting from her to Ethan. The leader dismounted slowly, his eyes sharp as knives. He walked toward Ethan and stopped only a few feet away. Ethan could feel the heat of the desert wind between them. Without breaking eye contact, he offered the wooden apple to the man. The Apache chief looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. Silence filled the air, heavy, tense, endless. Ethan didn't move. He could feel sweat on his neck, but he stood calm, like a man ready to accept whatever came. The leader turned to his warriors and said something low. They lowered their weapons. Ethan let out a slow breath. The chief looked at him again, his eyes no longer hard but thoughtful. He gave a short nod, then gestured for the others to wait. Lena stepped closer to Ethan, tears falling freely. She whispered, "Safe." It was the only English word she had learned clearly, but it said everything. The leader looked at her, then at Ethan, then spoke softly in Apache. The sound of his voice was deep and calm, like thunder far away. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he knew what they meant. He had been spared not by strength or weapon, but by kindness. The chief raised his hand and gave a command. The warriors slowly turned their horses and began to circle around the ranch, watching carefully but no longer threatening. As the sun climbed higher, the tension eased. Ethan stood still, holding his breath, while the echoes of hooves faded into the distance. The women wept quietly, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Ethan looked down at the spot where he had stood. Only the wooden apple remained in the dust, the mark of a man's heart written not in blood but in compassion. He didn't yet know it, but that moment would change his life forever. The morning air hung heavy with silence after the warriors left the ranch. Ethan stood where he had been, his boots half buried in the dust. The three Apache women stood close by, still trembling, their eyes darting toward the distant hills. The leader's nod still echoed in Ethan's mind, a silent promise that he had been spared, though he did not yet understand why. For a long while, none of them spoke. Only the wind whispered through the dry grass and the restless horses snorted in the corral. Finally, Ethan turned toward the women. "It's over," he said softly, though he wasn't sure it was true. He gave them a faint smile and they nodded, tears still glistening on their cheeks. He spent the next few hours mending the fence that had been knocked down by the riders' horses. The women helped without being asked. It seemed that working side by side brought them comfort. Lena stayed close to Ethan, handing him tools, sometimes pointing at things and trying to say their names in English. Her soft effort to speak his language made him smile in spite of the morning's fear. As the day wore on, Ethan kept glancing toward the hills. He could feel eyes on him, though he saw nothing but dust and dry rocks. The women moved carefully, still uneasy. It was clear they feared more riders might return. When the sun began to sink, painting the sky with orange and red, Ethan led the horse to the barn and locked the gate. "We'll be safe tonight," he said quietly. Inside the small house, the fire crackled in the hearth. Ethan cooked what little food they had left, beans, bread, and coffee. The women sat close to the warmth, whispering in their language. He didn't understand the words, but their tone had changed. There was less fear now, more peace. After dinner, Lena pointed to the carved wooden apples that sat on the shelf. She touched her heart, then said slowly, 3 apples, 3 lives. Ethan stared at her, realizing she had remembered those words. He nodded, feeling something warm rise in his chest. Yes, he said, pointing to them one by one. 3 apples, 3 lives. The other 2 women smiled for the first time that night. Ethan felt a small sense of pride. He had built a bridge between worlds, even if only with kindness and patience. Later that night, as the fire dimmed and the stars filled the sky, Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. He didn't expect trouble, but old habits from the war were hard to forget. He listened to the crickets and the slow breathing of the horses. For the first time in years, his ranch felt alive, not just a lonely stretch of land, but a place of hope. When morning came, the women were gone. Panic struck his chest like a hammer. He searched the barn, the well, and even the dry creek bed, but there was no sign of them. Only the wooden apples were missing from the shelf. Ethan's heart sank. He thought maybe they had run away out of fear, or had been taken back by the Apache warriors in the night. He saddled his horse and followed the faint footprints leading north. The trail was long and dry, winding between rocky hills. As he climbed higher, he saw smoke rising again, but this time it wasn't a war signal. It was a campfire. He rode closer and stopped when he saw them. Lena and the other 2 women standing beside the Apache leader from the day before. Around them sat a large group of warriors and families. It was a full Apache camp, alive with children, elders, and hunters. Ethan's pulse raced. He didn't dare move forward, but then Lena saw him. She smiled, gently, without fear, and waved for him to come. Ethan hesitated, but then urged his horse forward. The warriors watched him carefully, hands near their weapons, but they didn't attack. The leader rose and met him halfway. He had a calm, noble face and eyes that looked like they had seen too many battles. Ethan dismounted slowly and bowed his head, not sure what else to do. The leader stepped closer, holding something in his hand, a wooden apple. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was one of the ones he had carved. The man held it out, then placed it gently into Ethan's palm. His voice was deep when he spoke. Though Ethan couldn't understand every word, he caught a few, "Thanks, sister," and saved. Lena stepped beside the leader and spoke in broken English. "He my uncle," she said softly. He thought, "We dead, you, save us, he come for fight, but now, he come for peace." Ethan's eyes widened. He looked at the leader, who gave a slow nod of respect. Then, to Ethan's surprise, the man motioned for one of his young warriors to bring something. The warrior returned with a small basket. Inside were 3 red apples, real ones, fresh and shining in the sun. The leader placed them on the ground between them. Lena smiled and said, "Gift for you. Peace between you and us." Ethan bent down and picked up one apple. He turned it in his rough hands, feeling the weight of what it meant. "Peace," he said quietly. "Good." The leader smiled faintly, then clasped Ethan's shoulder. For the first time, Ethan felt the tension leave him completely. The Apache invited him to sit by their fire. He was offered food and coffee made from roasted beans. He watched children laugh and women weave baskets while the men told stories in their tongue. Even though he couldn't understand the words, the warmth in their faces told him everything. That night, Lena sat beside him under the starlit sky. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, 3 apples, 3 lives. You help us. We help you now. Ethan smiled gently. You already did, he said. She didn't understand all his words, but she smiled back anyway. When dawn came, the camp was alive with movement. Horses were saddled, fires put out, and families prepared to travel. The leader approached Ethan again. He handed him a leather pouch filled with dried meat and a small carving, a symbol of their tribe. Friend, he said simply. Lena walked him back to his horse. She pressed one of the 3 real apples into his hand. For you, she whispered. Remember us. Ethan nodded, unable to find words. He mounted his horse and looked back one last time. The Apache camp shimmered in the morning sun like a dream, fading slowly as he rode toward the horizon. When he returned to his ranch, the land felt different. It was no longer empty. It was a place touched by something rare, trust between 2 worlds that once hated each other. Ethan placed the apple Lena had given him on the table beside the carved wooden ones. They looked simple, yet they carried the story of courage, kindness, and peace. Years passed, and travelers who came across Ethan's ranch noticed something curious. Above his door hung 3 carved apples, polished smooth by time. No one knew what they meant, but they felt something when they saw them, a quiet message that needed no words. Sometimes, on lonely nights, Ethan would sit by the fire and stare at those apples. He would remember Lena's smile, the chief's nod, and the moment fear had turned into friendship. He often thought about how 3 strangers, broken and afraid, had changed his life forever. The desert outside still looked harsh and endless, but for Ethan Carter it was no longer empty. It carried voices, laughter, and memories that never faded. Every sunrise reminded him that even the smallest act of kindness, like sharing an apple, could save lives and bring peace to hearts that had long forgotten hope. And though many years later the ranch grew quiet again, people who passed by could still see the 3 wooden apples swaying gently above the porch. No one knew the full story behind them, but everyone who saw them felt the same thing: warmth, peace, and the reminder that sometimes one good man's heart can change the world.